Hi, this is Cass. I'm going to be talking about the accumulation model. So the accumulation model is based on immigration experience. So it's how immigrants relate to their home culture while they are learning how to deal with their new culture in their new country. Acculturation means it is the process of adjusting to a culture in a different country. So acculturation has different strategies that a person can do when they're in a new country or trying to learn a new culture. So one strategy is called assimilation strategy. The description of it is that that person gives up the home culture identity and work to fully interact with the new culture. The next strategy is separation strategy. This one is when the person holds onto the home culture identity and avoids interacting with the new culture. The next one is integration strategy. This is when the person holds onto the home culture identity at the same time they also work on interacting with the new culture. And then the last strategy that the textbook mentioned was marginalization strategy. This is when the person has little interest in maintaining culture identity with either the home or the new culture. And then a researcher named Maxwell Macaw developed a different culture/behavior types of acculturation to show how well a person may acculturate to deaf or hearing cultures. She came up with 5 dimensions that are part of the deaf acculturation scale, which is that scale is a measure that was developed to identify whether one is hearing acculturated. So the 5 dimensions are as follows. Culture identification, which is described as psychological identification with deaf or hearing people who are you most comfortable with, deaf or hearing people? Like, which culture do you identify with? The next dimension or domain is cultural involvement. So like how much is one involved in deaf culture activities or vice versa in the hearing culture activities. The next domain is cultural preferences. So do you prefer to be with deaf or hearing people? The next one is language competence. How well does one sign and understand sign language, like ASL, or how well does one speak and understand spoken English? And then the last one is cultural knowledge. So how well do you know deaf culture, such as what is their favorite jokes or what is their kind of like culture? Same thing for hearing culture. Do you know our nursery rhymes and stuff?
Hi, my name is Lizzie, and I did pages 167 to 169 of Chapter 6. The 2 sections that I worked on were the narrative approach and intersectionality. So it starts out talking about the narrative approach, and this is just another way that researchers can identify patterns within certain populations. Some researchers find that surveys and measures are too limiting, and so asking specific questions are too limiting to find patterns within populations. And so instead, they have people tell stories about their lives and what they believe in, and then they kind of take the core values and bits and pieces from those stories and find patterns within them. They believe that storytelling is a better source of information about individuality. And then it went on to talk about how the more that people accept their deaf identity and interact with the deaf community, the more that they're able to demand accommodations. And that was part of the narrative that they found amongst the population. A potential problem with this method is that people tell different parts of their stories at different times, and they may change their story from telling it 1 minute to the next. And so there's no consistency in their stories, and that can make things a little bit tricky. You also can't target specific things. Like, it's really easy to ask a question like, do you prefer the color blue or red? But when you ask somebody to tell a story about their favorite color, that might not come out in the story. And then the other thing that it mentioned is that data from interviews, such as the narrative approach, and then the measurements, such as asking specific questions and asking people to do surveys and that kind of stuff, actually support each other, and they have similar findings. This was a table that was included in the section. It showed a part of deaf identity development phases for deaf adults with hearing parents. There was the phase 1, taken for granted, thinking that they are like hearing people, and if they meet deaf people, they still feel like they are like the hearing people. To the phase 2, the alienation phase, acknowledging that hearing people don't understand them and that they don't understand hearing people. Phase 3, the affiliation phase, they start to recognize deaf as an identity and want to connect with deaf people as they understand them better, and hearing people kind of become different or outsiders, and they're not super comfortable with them anymore, and they have trouble communicating. And then phase 4, the deaf in my own way phase, they are more comfortable with deaf and hearing people, and they try to help hearing people understand them as a deaf individual. The last portion of the section that I read was about intersectionality, how race, class, gender, and individual characteristics intersect and create potential for overlapping discriminatory experiences. That was the definition that they provided within the book. So an example of intersectionality would be being deaf and queer, or deaf and Black. And then they went on to talk about, between like the narrative approach and the intersectionality sections, they talked about some individuals who were from other countries and then moved to the United States. I think it was specifically they had trouble like learning English, being homesick, finding halal food, and dealing with the individualistic philosophy of the United States, is like what the book says. It was Saudi Arabian deaf college students in the United States. But they found a lot of like solace in the fact that they were at Gallaudet University and they were with other deaf individuals, and so that kind of brought them comfort when they were dealing with so much other change in terms of like accepting a new culture in the United States. So I thought this section was really interesting because everybody has several different things about their identity that makes up their identity, such as being deaf and queer, or deaf and Black, or even like, you know, there's, for everybody, we all have different things that make up our identity, and so we all have some level of intersectionality. So for me, I'm a chronically ill person, I'm also a woman, and so those two kind of minority groups that I'm a part of really do make up part of my identity. And that's what intersectionality is all about. So that was my section that I was learning about today.
Okay, so I had pages 169 to 171, race and ethnicity. So, children are born to hearing families. Deaf may not be their core identity. Race and ethnicity of the family is the child's first or early core identity. The child will realize their deafness only when their hearing aids is out or when their cochlear implant is off, if they have that. This is when they will start to internalize the label deaf as part of their identity development. While this internalization occurs depends on many factors. So, child's exposure to family communication, support from the environment, positive or negative reactions that the child get from people they see. If the child has deaf parents and they're from a minority group, their deaf identity and racial ethnic identity will develop at the same time. Some examples include Black Afro-Latino, a deaf child, or a Black Jewish deaf child. Some children might struggle because they are a minority within a minority For example, a deaf Latinx has a different deaf culture than others. Being deaf also makes her part of another culture compared to hearing people. So this is more on that part. So there are many different race and ethnic groups within each ethnicity. So they're not just one group overall. The following different norms, behaviors, and values, they all experience similar challenges. So that goes with like someone who's deaf in these ethnic groups. It's not just Native American or indigenous groups. You have to remember that within these groups there are different parts of different tribes. So they might have different hand signs, so they might have different signs. And then there's Asian. Asians comes from different countries, not all the same, such as Korea, Thailand, Vietnam, Japan, Cambodia, China, and more, which means that their sign might be different. Same with Arabic. They can also come from different countries, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and again, the signs might be different. Then there's Black deaf. They are part of America, but claim an African heritage, and there are also some blacks from the Caribbean area and some from Africa who have to adjust to the deaf cultures in the United States. The way each group acts also depends on who they are. If they are deaf whites, do they act different? If they're with deaf whites, do they act different? If they're with people in hearing cultures, do they act different? So those are some questions people can ask themselves. This is why it is important for identities to be solid, yet fluid, with different ways of behaving in different situations. So you don't have to always, be deaf or, if you're in the hearing culture, know your deaf identity, but also intermingle in the hearing culture. You don't have to just be deaf in the hearing culture. So next I had sexual orientation. So what does it mean to be deaf and part of the LGBTQ community was the main question that was asked. And then a lot depends on how accepting friends and family are and the city you are in. That can have an effect on finding other deaf and LGBTQ others. The close-knit nature of the deaf community might make it easier for deaf LGBTQA individuals to feel safe and connected because of their friendship within the community. The chances of being rejected are decreased, but they're still possible. And then deaf LGBTQA can find a home when they find others like themselves. Gender and ethnic identities tend to be clear at a young age, but LGBTQA identities are developed later, which means the coming out stage is later in life. To be deaf, LGBTQA, and in a minority group can result in people dealing with a lot of self-acceptance and hoping others will accept them. This can result in a really emotional, painful coming out process for some people.
Alright, so this is from page 172 to 173 about disability. Around 40 to 50% of the deaf and hard of hearing population may have additional disabilities, and these disabilities interact with other identities that they may have. Disabilities like cerebral palsy, autism, blindness, etc. will affect communication and social opportunities, and they also may not feel or be accepted by the deaf community because of their disabilities. Cultural perspectives. Some cultures accept individuals who are deaf, some hide them, and some reject them. Some individuals rely on other people, like caretakers or significant others, and if they don't accept them, they may have trouble developing a sense of trust in themselves and also a strong identity. Deaf people with additional disabilities may also never see another person who is like them. In the book, they used an example of someone that is black, deaf, and has cerebral palsy, so I thought that was interesting. Some cultural deaf people view themselves as a population with its own language and culture, and this is a comparison to
other disability groups who have their own disability culture, but not like a unique language of their own. And then page 174, the conclusion. Internalizing each of the marginalized identities will help to build a stronger sense of self. There's also many other types of different identities like socioeconomic grouping, religion, work, and obviously way more. It's also important to recognize that culturally deaf identity will be shaped through interactions with other minority identities, and recognizing all of these identities and intersectionalities will help the deaf individual feel validated. Thank you.